we want to know where we are, we're at the Library of Innerpeffray. It's so little known about this, but it's been here for hundreds of years. As I mentioned, it's Scotland's oldest lending library, with treasures in here that we want to share with you. And I will say, this library is not open on Mondays and Tuesdays, but it has been open specially for Mike and I so that we can do this special little broadcast to you guys as well. So this is something really special that we've organised here, and we don't want you to miss this. And we hopefully, after this, when we've done it, everything's working fine, you can share it with other people as well. So let's go in. We have Lara Haggerty, who's the keeper of the books here at the Innerpeffray Library, and she is going to take us on a wee tour of some of the treasures that are in this building. Let's go inside. We came here as part of our Blue Badge training many, many years ago, back in 2013, I think it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know about this, and I don't live far from here. I think, Mike, you may have known about it, but had never visited here. Yeah. And it's so strange that we've got this hidden treasure here in Scotland that a lot of Scots don't know about it as well.
It's very true. It's partly because we're so small and we're so tucked away. Innerpeffray used to be on a major river crossing, so we were on a busy main road, but today nobody drives their car through the river, so we've been left behind, and that makes for a very peaceful, tranquil place to have a library, but it also means that you have to work to find us.
Indeed. Now, just to give people, so I know a lot of people who like to look at to find out exactly where we are when we're out of Edinburgh, we're at Innerpeffray. Just describe sort of geographically how people can find us where we are on a map.
So we're right in the centre of Scotland, where the Highlands meet the Lowlands. If you draw a straight line from Perth on the east coast and you go west, you eventually hit Crieff, which is the big market town. That's about 5 miles to the northwest of us. And if you kept on going south, you'd end up at Gleneagles. So we're right in the centre, and we're in a beautiful river valley, Strathearn, where the River Erne ends up in Loch Erne to the west of us here. So.
And it is gorgeous. We're in the heart of beautiful Perthshire as well. And it's interesting you mentioned Gleneagles, because one of the little things that I do, I take a lot of people up golfing to Gleneagles. And some of the partners are not enthralled by golfing, so they want to do other things. And I actually have brought people over here to come and see this. So it's good that we're getting to expose it to a much larger audience as well. Now, I want to start asking you about a wee bit of the history of the library, because I have mentioned it's Scotland's oldest lending library. Could you give us a wee sort of potted history of why it's here, who built it, and the reasons behind it? Would you be able to do that?
Absolutely. So, as you said, Innerpeffray is the very first free public lending library in Scotland. We've been here since 1680, though I haven't been here personally quite that long. It was started by a local man who is a member of the Drummond family. So the Drummonds are the big landowning family around here, so not surprising that he could afford books. But a very radical idea to lend them out to ordinary working people who lived around here. So it was a mad idea that he had. But he was a canny Scotsman, and he wrote the details down in his will, creating my job at the same time, and also making sure that the family were charged with the responsibility of keeping it all going. Now, he doesn't tell us why, but he starts the library and a school for local children and is adamant that they're to be kept going for time coming, he says in the will.
So we're going back to the 1600s. Scotland's gone through sort of political turmoil. We've got the Reformation is fully underway, but we've got a few battles going on to establish who's who. We've got the Stuarts. They would be on the throne just then. They would just be the Stuarts, just about to be deposed. So we're in a big turmoil. I mean, we've got armies marching up and down here. This place must have seen some history itself.
Oh, absolutely, and our founder is in the thick of it. He was born in 1611 and he doesn't die until the 1690s. So I'm always astounded that he survived the 17th century. It's so full of battles and war, as you say. He was in the thick of it too. He's in the politics. He's the best friend of the first Marquis of Montrose, who of course a famous military captain and loses his head because of it. But he fled abroad. He was even put in prison, our founder, that is. So we don't know why he'd started the library and school, but it's very tempting to think he wanted to leave a better world behind.
I know it wasn't difficult to know, just leave a better world behind. And also you got all the way through the whole history. We've been talking about the Jacobites, so you go into the next century, you've got the Jacobite rebellions as well. So this place is just steeped in history, because we know that one of the villages close to here, a wee village called Muthil, was actually burnt down. And there was, Bonnie Prince Charlie stayed up in Crieff as well, I believe, as well.
That's correct. I mean, the Drummond family were staunch Jacobites. Lord John Drummond was on the front line at Culloden. But unfortunately, the local villages were a little bit annoyed at having to give out all of their food in the middle of a desperate winter to the Jacobite troops. And to teach them a lesson, despite the fact that these were loyal supporters, the Jacobite burned, as you see, Muthil and a couple of the other villages round here. It didn't go down well. The Drummonds forfeited their estates, and it took years for them to claim them back. So, yeah, we're absolutely saturated in history here. We're a tiny place, but big story.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now I'm going to want to focus more on the library itself. Having survived since 1680, right up to, you said you told me before, the last book that was lent out was in 1968. Okay, so it's been lending books up there. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about some of the books that you have here. You've very kindly got some lovely little treasures for us to look at. We're also celebrating at the moment the 250th anniversary of the birth of Sir Walter Scott. And we've got some exhibitions here, so we're going to look at that. And I'm not going to mention what we're going to show at the end, because that, to me, is a real treasure. And I think our viewers are going to be so delighted to be able to go and show something that I've never seen before, Mike has never seen before. And I got a little bit of a buzz about what's coming up as well. So should we start talking about your exhibition here, and tell us more about the library and how, what you see as the major features that we'd want people to come and see here in the library?
Yeah, of course. The library started life in a different building to the one we're in now. It started in Innerpeffray Chapel, which is next door. I mean, literally next door. You can barely get a person in between the two buildings. And that was the private chapel of the Drummond family. But it wasn't a church library. They just used this convenient empty building. But it wasn't long before the family thought that this little room in the chapel was not good enough. And this beautiful Georgian building was built to house the new books. And so we've been adding to the collection slowly over time. It kind of grew with the need to read, if you like. And it was always used by the local people who lived and worked on the farms and estates nearby. And we know that because we've got our most precious book, which is the register of our borrowers. And that records every single person who borrowed a book from I even got the wrong date, how about that? From 1747 right up till 1968. So I like to think that the dust was settling after the Battle of Culloden, and at Innerpeffray they got organised and they started writing things down. We don't know how it worked before, but in the early days people used to write a promise that they would bring their book back. Mm-hmm. That makes a legally binding contract, all you lawyers out there. Yeah. and of course a book was an immensely valuable thing. If I told you that I had 400 classic cars, you would think that I was really quite a collector. And if I said to you, well, you can borrow any one of them you like, here's the keys, just bring them back in a couple of weeks' time, I'm sure you'd think that I was completely crazy. But that was the equivalent to what our founder did when he lent out his very precious books. And the people around here borrowed them. Mm-hmm. One of the most popular authors in the 19th century was Sir Walter Scott. And so for us, there was no question. We had to celebrate his 250th anniversary with an exhibition looking at his popularity and actually the influence that he had on how we view Scotland today, because I don't think that can be underestimated. He turned it from a gloomy backwater that nobody wanted to go to into the height of romance, landscapes that people wanted to engage with, and a culture that we still have today.
And he started a whole chain of events. Because some of his popular readers also wanted to come up to Scotland. One of the main ones being Queen Victoria, of course. And of course, she was very influential in her way. And so anything that Queen Victoria did, others followed. And so she would want to see her northern part of her empire, as it were, or up here in Scotland. And already having the knowledge or the influence of Scots with the romance of the Highlands, and she would be bringing other people up, and suddenly the whole of the tourism started, and that's what Mike and I have got to thank Walter Scott for, because we are blue badge tourist guides. So let's doff a cap off to Sir Walter Scott.
And this wonderful book, which is called A Voyage Around the North and Northwest Coast of Scotland by William Daniel, is full of beautiful aquatints of the coastal scenery. The one I've got on open at the moment is looking at the Sheehan Islands. And I'm going to open the case because that'll make it easier for Mike to get in close to it. And you can see the enormous glowering cliff and the seabirds as clouds in front of it. And this was something people had really never experienced before. Danielle did this voyage around the coast, and Scott did a voyage around the coast as well. He was invited, actually, to go with the Northern Lighthouse Commissioners and see Scotland from the sea. Mm-hmm. And he couldn't turn that down. And he went with Robert Stevenson, who we know, of course, is the lighthouse man, but also the grandfather of Robert Louis Stevenson, who became another of Scotland's giant novel writers. One of the places they visited was Staffa and Fingal's Cave, which has inspired so many people. The music of Mendelssohn, Turner has painted it. Scott himself said he found it impossible to describe, but then he had a go. And this is an incredible kind of basalt formation just off the coast of Mull. It's very difficult to get to. There's a whirlpool not far away, and so if the weather's not good, you can't go. But Queen Victoria was one of the few people who did manage to go there. And if you get a chance to go today, I definitely recommend it.
I would highly recommend it. It's very close to Iona, so you can do the holy island of Iona, and you can do Staffa on the same day, on the same trip. And I would highly recommend going to Staffa when the puffins are there, when they're nesting underground. You're not disturbing them. They actually love it when humans are on there because it protects them from the birds that predate on them. So they will sit on the ocean or the water and wait until a human comes and sits by their burrows, and then the little puffins will take off because they know that the birds of prey are not going to come down and get them. I didn't know that until it was explained when I got there.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It is.
I'm just looking at this here because the artist in me, I'm always drawn to Turner. And Lara was telling me earlier on that this was an engraving that Joseph William Mowell Turner, the famous English painter, made of Staffa because he used to accompany Scott and illustrate his journals. And they were great friends, I believe, as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, they were.
And it's good to put them in context because we're looking at Scott, we're looking at them. Wordsworth is a friend of his, the Quincy, we've all mentioned these, so they were all put them in contemporary writers all together. But let's focus a wee bit more on Walter Scott, give him his credit. It's 250 years since he was born. We owe a lot to him in Scotland, and let's have a wee bit more. Can we look in some more of the cases?
We certainly can.
Yeah.
This one here showing an unusual view of Abbotsford, Scott's borders home that he built for himself. And here he is in the corner of the picture there with one of his beautiful dogs. He was really fond of his dogs. Quite hard to see whether that's Maida, his favourite. But this was the landscape that he was to continue to return to. And even towards the end of his life, when he was very ill, he went to the continent, he went to Italy to try and get good air for his bad lungs. But he wasn't getting any relief. So he said, well, I want to be in Scotland then. And he came home. So I think that tells us everything, doesn't it? It was where he wanted to be.
Could we have a wee look inside the case, please, Lara? I think we're getting a wee bit of reflection of the light, because I think this Abbotsford is, if you haven't been there, it's one of the top places to go in the Scottish borders, his amazing house.
Yes, Aberford's also open to the public, so would highly recommend if you're on your tours. It's in the borders, but there's a new train line that's been opened as well, which will take you down from Edinburgh Waverley Station. And of course, Waverley Station is named after the Waverley novels. There's so many connections with Walter Scott. He has a big influence on Scotland. But there's a train now you can take down, not direct to the house, but close to the house when you get there. so it makes it easier to go around.
And a fabulous place to see all the things that Scott collected, because it wasn't long before his interest in folk tales, music and ballads became an interest in the tangible objects of life itself, and he collected everything and was enthusiastic about ancient history and contemporary history. And the Battle of Waterloo took place in his lifetime, and he was over there in France looking to see what he could get from the battle site, probably, you know, buying things from enterprising peasants. I think the phrase that curator Abbotsford used is, and filling his home with these amazing stories. On the other side of our room here, the exhibition looks at these stories. It looks at fact and fiction. Here at Innerpeffray, our collection is much smaller than the one that Scott had at Abbotsford, but it's similar in style in that he collected things from all ages. And so we've given you a few examples here of how he might have used a history book from the Battle of Culloden, showing the battle plan, the Jacobite ballads, pro and for, and a book which tells the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie anonymously, in order to not be prosecuted for treason, but tells it as a novel, as though he's a real person going about some kind of Walter Scott type story. And so Scott used these things and used them as background material. He was, like the historians of old, never one to let the facts get in the way of a good story. And I often hear people complaining that he messes about with history. But, well, he's not really trying to tell you history. He's trying to tell you a really good story. So Waverley, which was the first of his Waverley novels, uses the Battle of Culloden and the Jacobite Risings as the background story. So that's a good place to start if you like the Jacobites. But there are many, many more stories, and he told stories about all eras in history. We've got the wanderings of Robert the Bruce. He used that voyage round the coast as background for that, and his visit to Skye and to the Western Isles provided the backdrop. And then back in the borders, he's got Melrose and all the abbeys in the borders for his novels, the Monastery and the Abbot. And he wrote many, many. There are 26 Waverley novels, not including the poetry as well. So there are many, many stories to tell.
He was very prolific in his time and very well read. I heard a quote saying that he was like the J.K. Rowlings of his period, you know, most in terms of the English-speaking world. But he did write in Scots, and he also wrote in English. And I know that some of the books that I've read in the old Scots, they always had a glossary at the back to help the non-Scots speakers as well, which I had to use a lot as well, because a lot of words that I don't know in the Scots language, that I was constantly in the glossary saying, what does that mean? But once you got the meaning, you actually got it really took you back to the period he was writing in and the characters. And to see it written in English and then to see it written in Scots, I did see a difference in it. I had a different feeling from it, because I think it was more, the Scots language was much more descriptive rather than the English language. There's something missing in the translation itself. But this is a great collection here in itself. And it's fair to say that with Walter Scott, before he started to write it, people had an impression that Scotland was a dark place, full of warfare, full of these tribes running around, killing themselves. And they weren't too wrong. No. I mean, a lot of that was in truth as well. There was a lot of bloodshed going on. But certainly after the 1746 Battle of Culloden, things were changing up here, and it's good that Walter Scott had the distance. He was looking back on it, and he used distance almost as a protection to be able to write about that period as well. So, and then make the romance come out, and people come up to see as well. I think it's a wonderful collection you've got here on Walter Scott and celebrating his 250th. But that's not all you've got in here. There's some other little treasures. I had the honour a few weeks ago of coming up here, and it was an honour and a pleasure to come up to an evening that you had organised with the Friends of Innerpeffray Library, FOIL. And that's a support group that you have. Can you maybe mention a wee bit about FOIL?
Absolutely. FOIL was set up just over 25 years ago, and they helped the library in a time of, well, shall we say, a time when people weren't really caring about this beautiful little library. And a group of local people got together to do something about that. And the Friends Foyle, as they're known, would put on all sorts of wonderful events, including a fabulous carol concert, which we've been missing these past few years. And also they run social events for local people, and they raise us lots of money. What more could we ask for? They're a really lovely bunch of people, and we have friends all over the world, which is just fantastic. And they were asking me to put together some books for an evening of entertainment. They said, well, I thought, well, what are you going to do? And they were going to have a blue badge guide come and tell stories based on our collection, which I just thought was the best idea ever. It's food and stories. Excellent.
It was a great evening, and I am now an honorary lifelong member of the Friends of Innerpeffray Library. So if you want to Google that, you can Google Friends of Innerpeffray Library, and you can find out how maybe some of our viewers could become a friend of Innerpeffray as well.
We would love you to do that.
Excellent. And one of the things you did for me when I was up here as well, the stories I was telling were about the witches, because I've got a keen interest on witches, and even nowadays about how they're trying to rewrite the history here about the women, which I think is really important, because these women were victimised and they were murdered. You can't question it, they were murdered for simple things. And I'm really interested in that. But you have got a book here that interested me, and it was a book which really set the scene as to how to identify witches.
That's right. People often hear about King James the First and Sixth, or Sixth and First, story that he wrote a book about demonology and he was really against witches and so on. And he did indeed write that book. We have a copy sitting waiting over there. But the reason that he wrote this book was another book by a man called Reginald Scott, called The Discovery of Witchcraft. And this discovery means a kind of unveiling or a revealing of witchcraft. And it's a debunking book. He felt very strongly that although he believed in witches and witchcraft, that a lot of people were being persecuted and tormented for being simply old or odd. So he wrote this book. Amazingly, he survived. He wasn't executed for this. But King James wrote his book in response to it, to make sure that everybody knew exactly what witches were all about. So it's great here that Innerpeffray that we have them both, and they both belong to our founder. This was his time, it was his lifetime. He was born the year the King James Bible came out. So this was a very important piece of culture at the time.
Do we have a wee look?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Scott's book first came out in 1597. We've got a later edition, printed in 1665. It has a huge title. I've already said The Discovery of Witchcraft. And underneath it says, proving that the compacts and contracts of witches with devils and all infernal spirits or familiars are but erroneous novelties and imaginary conceptions. Also discovering how far their power extendeth in killing, tormenting, confirming, or curing the bodies of men, women, children, or animals by charms, philters, perapts, pentacles, curses, and conjurations.
That is some title of a book. That's
it's not finished yet.
That will get you hooked. That will be flying off the shelves. So in here, he is trying to, again, focus on some of the women who've been victimised. So people were realising that at the time. But just having a look at the book itself, it's just these treasures. And people can come to the library, and can they get access? Can they open these books?
We are very happy to bring books out. During the coronavirus pandemic, we've had to restrict how people handle the books because we can't clean them, of course. But we will handle them for you. We'll turn the pages. And as soon as we're given the all clear, people will again be able to sit and read Innerpeffray's books. You get a short course on to how to handle them, and then, yeah, that's what they're there. What's the point of having books if you can't read them?
Absolutely. And I believe, I would say that a couple of years ago, and you had a researchers in here, so people use this as a research library as well?
Absolutely. We use it for research, and people also use it for non-academic research, if you like. We get a lot of novelists who are looking for contemporary information, and some people are just using it as an inspiration. It's something that they've, the concept of the place itself is quite inspiring, but Innerpeffray's been a place of inspiration for 340 years. Yeah.
Let's have a wee look at the King James book here.
So this is the whole works of that most mighty prince, and
Even though he says so himself.
Even though he says so himself, indeed. Printed by the King's printer, of course. Very nice title page. And then, I don't know if you can zoom in on this, Mike.
I think we've
Is it
done
going
something
wonky?
here.
But
I
on the
think we're
top,
okay again, yeah.
on the top left-hand corner, there is a little bit of a scribble of ink. And that scribble actually is our founder's signature. It says Madarty. So that's his name, his title. And he signed all the books that he owned. And that is the thing that gives me the shiver when I'm taking books off the shelf, is to think that this was one that our founder read and then left here for other people to read after him.
And that to me is the history of it as well. It's not just the books themselves. Every book tells a story, but there's so many other layers of this. The people who owned the book, he lent the book out. Mm-hmm. Other people have read this book. And it's just the whole connections of people down through history. And that's where I get a buzz from this as well. So have a look at this. It's just so amazing.
I'm just going to turn it to it's his full work. So he wrote several books. He was a very learned man. And this is the famous one, the demonology, in the form of a dialogue. This was a classic way to present information, somebody having a conversation with someone else, like we're having today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He also famously wrote about the gunpowder treason. So the plot of Guy Fawkes, or Guido Fawkes, as he calls him, and an interrogation of the prisoners, which is a little bit grisly. And there's also a fabulous treatise on tobacco.
Oh.
He considered smoking to be an absolute abomination, and he has a really good rant about how bad it is for you, which, considering it's only just come over from Virginia, is quite impressive. Mm. He says it's in the black stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless.
That will stop you smoking. You should put that in cigarette packets.
Although at the time they were smoking uncured tobacco leaf,
yeah.
So it probably was pretty black and stinking. Yes.
And that's all in this book here.
All in this book here.
This is just amazing. Yeah. And also the fact that he's writing about a plot that was designed against him, the Guy Fawkes plot, the 5th of November. We all remember that as kids, the songs, the 5th, remember the 5th of November. So he's even writing about a plot that was against him. I think that's amazing as well. I guess he's telling his own history in that as well.
Indeed. One of the other books in here is called his advice to his son, the Basilican Doran, and he wanted to tell Henry, who was his oldest son, who sadly died when he was in his early teens, he wanted to tell him how to be a good king. He wanted to pass on the lessons that he'd had, and well, pretty tough job being king of not just Scotland, England, but also Ireland and France. Mm-hmm.
It's a tough gig.
It's a tough gig, yeah.
Especially the French part. So, another part of the history that we have here is the history of the people who borrowed the books. And I think the register is fascinating as well. Can we look at some of the registers you've got here as well? So the register goes back to 1747.
Yeah. This is the early part where you can see this promise that the borrowers are writing. They give the day, and I'll just read one out to you as an example. I, a student at Cowgask, which is a farm not far from here, borrowed out of the library of Innerpeffray Abernethy's Sermons, volumes 2 and 3. Okay, I wonder if he's read one and liked it, which I promised to return in good order 4 weeks after this date. And then he signed, and his name is John Wytock. One of my great pleasures of my job, I confess it's a lovely job working here at Innerpeffray, but is that when we're able to trace families of people today, and we get visitors from all over the world. And one of those people that I met was a family from Pennsylvania, the McRobbie family. And the McRobbies used to live in Crieff, so really close by here, about 4 miles away. And Bob McRobbie had retired and decided to come back to Scotland to see where his ancestors had come from. The family had emigrated from Crieff in about 1812. And he came to Innerpeffray by accident because we had a graveyard, and he was interested in graveyards. And came in, and we had got chatting, and I said, oh, do you know, I wonder if there were any McRobbies who borrowed books here. At the time, we did not have a database of the register. We do now. But we looked by hand through the register and we found his great-great-great-great-grandfather, James McRobbie, in 1753, so right at the beginning of the record. If he'd been a decade earlier, we just wouldn't have found him at all, because we wouldn't have been written down. And he couldn't believe it. We were looking at it and he's saying, that's my great-granddaddy's handwriting. And I said, well, hang on a minute. And I went to the shelf and I got the book that he'd borrowed. And he's holding it. And I thought he was actually going to faint. I was feeling quite emotional. His wife was saying, are you okay? And he was so overwhelmed. And we still keep in touch with the McRobbie family today. They've got a special family history centre in their town, and they've got their family Bible where it records all these people. But the best thing of all for me was that he had been doing his family history, so he could tell me about James, who was newly married, and he was living just the other side of the wood outside the library here, so a stone's throw away. And as a newly married young man, he came to Innerpeffray and he borrowed a book about how to live a good life and how to cope when times were tough, which is something we all need. Our record said that he was working as a tailor, and that was something that Bob didn't know, so we kind of shared a bit of information then. But yeah, it's happened more times than I thought would be possible, and it's always amazing when it happens.
Fascinating. It's just having this record here, not only of the books, not only of the first editions you've got here, but also living history. People can come here for a very different reason, just to see. And if somebody wanted to get in touch, when they come to Scotland, they want to get in touch, you say you've got it all in database now, so they can actually do a quick search as to. I think that's fascinating. You're going to have a lot of people probably beating a path to your door now.
Well, it is a very local area that we represent. So if you're interested in family history, great. It's interesting in itself, but the families that we have tend to be within 10 miles of us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that makes sense because you want to borrow a book, you want to keep it local, etc. But it's just fascinating that he was holding the same book that his ancestor held, and his ancestor was just walking around the library, picking up books and think, oh, I think I'll take that one, not knowing that a couple of hundred years later, someone's going to be searching. I mean, it's just...
incredible, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah. It's almost like a time warp, isn't it?
And you think about when I handle these books, and I think about all of the people who've handled them before and what they've discovered in them, whether they've liked them or not. Unfortunately, because we're a library, people tend not to write in their books. On one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, you want to know what people thought of them, don't you?
Yeah. In modern times, when I buy a book, I always sign it myself and put the date on it. When I've finished it, either give it to a second-hand bookshop or pass it on. And I ask the book, to whoever I lend it to pass that book on, to sign it and pass it on. So there's quite a few books circulating. One book I got back, The White Hotel, I'll never forget it. It came back, I thought, oh, I must reread that. Somebody gave it to me, and it was a book that I had lent it about 15 years before, and still in circulation.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing. Yeah. I like that. It's your very own lending library.
One book. Is there anything else you'd like to show us up here where we're...
I'd quite like to show you these really falling apart looking books for a very simple reason. This is the first set of Walter Scott books that we had here at Innerpeffray. We got them quite late on. They're not fancy first editions. They came to us in 1856 and we got the full set. I know that because they're borrowed in our register. But as you can see, they are absolutely falling apart. They have been read to death, we like to say. Maybe these were the least popular because they're the only 3 that survive. But this just tells you how popular Walter Scott was with our readers here at Innerpeffray. They had never had anything like it. They were eating them, you might say, lapping them up. We knew that they liked history, but this was, exciting history. It had stories in it, and it was about world history, not just Scotland. He's here. He's talking about European history as well. So that's just a favourite thing of mine for this year is just how popular Scott was. Children read him. The minister of the parish read him. It's the whole spectrum.
Excellent. Now, it's not just Walter Scott you have here in terms of first editions. I understand you've got some other famous Scottish writers that you have here stored away. We just recently did a little feature on J.M. Barrie. We've also mentioned Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the great influential writers of this time as well. We've mentioned, well, John Buchan of 39 Steps, going to hear a wee bit more about him. And one of my favourites is George Mackay Brown. And we've discussed him before, but can you show us some more of the other authors that you have in another part of the library?
Absolutely. About 10 years ago, we were very fortunate to receive an incredible gift from an American collector. Janet Saint-Germain had spent 35 years putting together a collection of Scottish first editions, and Janet's enjoyment was all things Scottish. So when I say they're Scottish first editions, they're about Scotland, they've got theme is Scotland, they're by Scottish authors. They're incredibly varied, just with this strand of Scottishness running through them. And she was fortunate to be able to purchase very special first editions, some of them with amazing histories of their own, and she donated them to Innerpeffray so that we could share them with other people. This was what she wanted. She didn't want the collection to be broken up and lost, and she spent a lot of time putting it together, but she loved the ethos of Innerpeffray, where you could still come and see things and sometimes read them. So I would love to show you some of the books that Janet's given us.
And she was from where?
She was originally from New York and latterly from Vermont, but with Scottish ancestry on both sides of her family.
Okay, so she has a real strong blood connection to Scotland, and it all came back here. Again, this is amazing. And this is one of the little gems that I said at the very beginning that we're going to see.
Did you mention how many books are in the library? Is there a digitised catalogue online?
So we've got about 5,000 books today, built up slowly over time. Janet's donation of books, probably the largest recent donation. We don't usually take books now. Janet's collection was just so special that we felt that was a really important thing to take. We're working on a new catalogue at the moment. So we did have an online catalogue, but it was in software that died, shall we say. So we're working on a new one at the moment. Although all our much older books, or pre-1800 books, are listed on the national and international databases, so you can look these up, like the King James's works, and you'll see that there are copies in libraries all over the world, and there's Innerpeffray's copy in the list. Any questions in the meantime about books that we have here, you can just refer to me by email.
Well, we're getting lots of comments about what a great place this is, and many people who are desperate to come and really enjoying your explanation of these publications. It is truly a great gem here in Perthshire.
Yeah. It certainly is.
Yeah.
And now we're going to another part of the library, which is under lock and key at the moment. So this is very, very special. We've got some absolute treasures downstairs that we're going to have a little look at.
I'm going to take you down to the ground floor of the library, which actually used to be the keeper's house. And so you didn't escape, you had to live on the ground floor. And it's much smaller, and it was lived in until the 1940s, but it was abandoned for quite a long time. So this is all recently redeveloped, shall we say, and refurbished.
Okay.
So let's make our way downstairs. And we'll see some of these first editions. So let's talk a wee bit more about Janet's gift of books. Shall we start with that?
Yes.
And maybe you can talk us through some of the ones you've got in exhibit here as well.
So Janet's books are incredibly varied in subject matter. She really liked music and poetry, and so we've got a lot of that. But she also was interested in 19th century novels and 18th century philosophy and sciences. So huge range of subjects. This year, we were delighted to be able to show off some of her Walter Scott collection. Janet loved Scott, and she has pretty much everything that he wrote in first edition. They look a little bit sad and tatty in the cases here because they were produced quickly and cheaply through the new technology that was available for printing and paper making. And a lot of these books are ex-library books. This set here in particular spent most of their life down in Devon, but they managed to call it. This is very similar to the one we looked at upstairs, which tells the story of Bonnie Prince Charlie anonymously as though it's a novel. So it's called The Young Chevalier, this one. And the signature, Walter Scott, is in the top right-hand corner. And underneath it, there's another word. Now, I couldn't read this word originally. And so I contacted the librarian who was cataloguing Abbotsford and said, I think I've got a Walter Scott signature here. Can you help? And she said, oh, absolutely. And I sent her a photograph and she said, yeah, that's definitely him. And the word underneath says duplicate.
Oh, okay.
I thought, okay, so we had two. And she said, yes, but it's more exciting than that because I've never seen a duplicate before. So a very special Scott book. He must have had two, and he probably gave it away because he was a very generous, kind of gregarious chap. Although it might have been sold, but we think it was probably given away. Gone all the way over to America and now come home to Scotland, as Janet wanted.
As just the travels of these books as well.
Yes.
Back to back, right to where they belong.
Sitting beside that book is a little note. It's a letter in Scott's own handwriting. It's dated from the year before he died. The first part of the letter, he's writing to Sir Francis. We think it's Sir Francis Freeling, who was a friend of his and another book collector. And in the postscript, he's having a grumble. He's grumbling that the doctor, who he calls worse than unruly Philistines, are not allowing him more than half a wine glass of whiskey for a whole day's debauch.
Debauch.
Debauch, yes. I think he likes he's going to have a debauch.
He's going to have a debauch. He's not going to have a quiet drink. He's going to go for the full debauch.
He doesn't mention how much claret the doctor's allowing him,
Oh, that's true.
but half a wine glass of whiskey.
Yeah.
And then he manages to slip in a wee Robert Burns quote there as well as a
Excellent.
kind of justification. He says, who ne'er good wine did fear man. So yeah, shouldn't be afraid of a little bit of whiskey.
Yeah, and so you got Walter Scott, who predates Burns. No, he came after Burns.
comes after Burns, yeah.
And so you get him, you've got Walter Scott quoting Burns, and you've also got some Burns
We also do,
first
yes.
editions as well.
We have some very special Robert Burns material.
Okay.
I've put out two little pieces of it for you to see, which is just on the other side here.
Okay, but I think it's great you got Walter Scott, because I think Walter Scott actually attended one of the salons that Robert Burns was speaking at as well. So he would have met Burns.
He did. He met him when at quite a young age. There's a famous painting, probably imaginary, but he did meet him when he was a youngster. Yeah, early teenager. Yeah.
Excellent. This is. I am fascinated by this. This makes me weak at the knees, actually. We're getting to see this. So, Lara, I'll let you explain.
Okay. When Robert Burns was first writing his poetry, he didn't think it would come to anything. But his friends persuaded him to have a book published. And they printed in the local Kilmarnock press 511 copies of this book here, which is known as the Kilmarnock Edition. This is the copy that Janet Saint-Germain owned. It was a good friend to her. She kept it beside her bed. And it's got a beautiful, what they call contemporary calf cover. So this was put on at the time that it was bought. So the person who bought it had the cover put on straight away. Usually when you see a Kilmarnock edition, it's got a very plain cardboard cover, like the Scots we were looking at. So this is one of only 12 that exist in private hands in the world, and it is his poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, by Robert Burns, printed in 1788. This one has, on this side, I'll just lift this piece, Melanic Soffit. It's there, and in order to hold that back, so you can see. It's got a little note on the inside there when somebody's put in an epigram that they found in an inn, and they wanted to add that to the book, which is lovely. So who was this? Well, the owner who wrote these words was actually Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford Wright, indeed, who was the treasurer of the Dalry Burns Club. So Dalry is in Ayrshire as well, so he's another local man, and he owned this book in 1820. So it's got a fabulous history as well, a provenance, we call it, when you know about the former owners.
And the first owner must have been quite wealthy to bind it in contemporary calf
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely a sign that he also cared about it, that he wanted to have it as a lasting thing. The reason there are so few of these in the world is, of course, that Burns became a hit and popular, and he immediately brought out an Edinburgh edition and then a London edition, even a Philadelphia edition of his poems was printed in America by friends there, though he didn't get any money for it. So people took that first one that they had, the Kilmarnock edition, and they chucked it, got a fancy new one with a fancy cover.
Yeah.
So,
And it's landed here.
And it's landed here. I mean, it's beautiful to have this. We know that Burns was in this area. He visited the Murrays of Ottertyre, which is just the other side of Crieff, so it's about 10 miles from here. I would love to think he visited, but I can definitely tell you he didn't borrow a book.
Okay.
Something I'm quite glad about. He's quite an unreliable character, really, wasn't it? Yeah. Who knows where it would have ended up?
Well, he was on his travels. He probably had a little to carry, and no one would carry a book,
Indeed, yes. Yeah. The other thing that I'd like to show you is, in some ways, even more special because it is utterly unique. It is a piece of Robert Burns' handwriting. It's a song, Wilt Thou Be My Dearie, so one of his love songs. And he's even told us which tune he thinks we should sing it to. The tune being The Suitor's Daughter, or that's the shoemaker's daughter.
I like the way he says doctor.
Doctor, yeah.
D-O-C-H. Oh,
written in the Scots.
Yeah.
And he's written it out, and he's written this copy specially for someone, a girl called Janet Miller. And Janet was the daughter of his landlord at Ellisland Farm, and he's dedicating this copy to her. And the reason it's unique is not only that it's in his own handwriting, but in the last stanza in the bottom of this side of the page we can see he says, Jeanie, say thou loes me, or if thou willna be my ain, say na thou'lt refuse me. And if you see that in print in a book, it will say, Lassie, say thou loes me. So this was Jeanie's copy, just for her, that he dedicates, as it says on the other side, with unalterable regard.
Oh.
That is ranking high in our hidden gem. Well, it's not such a hidden gem, but as a gem, that is just amazing. Yeah.
For us, as tourist guides, to be able to see this written by Burns is just amazing. And the fact that he wrote it, he probably gave it to her, it's been passed around, it's travelled around, it ended up in the United States, in Janet's possession, and then she's gifted it back. Again, the provenance of this piece of paper, and I mean it's priceless, I guess. It
is, because as we've been saying about so many things here, it tells a story, doesn't it? It tells a story of a girl and a poet and a collector and all of these things. Yeah.
So you're going to have lots of people from the Burn societies all over the world beating a path to come and see this.
Well, they'd be welcome. We try and get our Kilmarnock edition out at least once every 2 years on display, but like a lot of books from that era, it's quite fragile, so it's not always out. So if you're coming specially to see it, let me know in advance. I wouldn't like it to be off being mended or something and you've travelled a long way. But we will definitely show you very special things here. And I mentioned the Edinburgh, London and Philadelphia editions. We've got those too.
We got the lot.
We got the lot. Yes. All thanks to Janet Saint-Germain and her enthusiasm for Scotland. Yeah.
That's excellent. And recently we did a little feature on J.M. Barrie. I believe we've got some of Barrie's first editions.
Yes. I'm just going to fold this slightly back inside its case.
Protect it.
Yeah, to protect it. And so I know where it is. And if we go to the other side of the room, I'll open the case. I don't think we've got everything written by Barrie, but we've got a couple of very special things.
I think I'm especially interested in this one because it is called Quality Street and it was based on Ann Street in Edinburgh, where we did a little virtual tour. So just look at that. Look at the...
This is a very special kind of book binding, very decorative. You've got the gold embossing. And then this is, it's almost like an applique, so the pieces of coloured leather are cut out and then the coloured pieces put in. It's quite incredible to look at. Of course, some of you watching in the UK will recognise the girl as the Quality Street sweetie jar lady.
Oh, of course.
Yes,
I never. So our UK viewers will know that who does Quality Street? Is it Rowntree's or Cadbury's? They've been doing quality. One of these things you get in the tin at Christmas time. You get a tin of Quality Street sweeties, candies. I never made that connection before.
I think it's maybe Roundtree. I don't think it's Cadbury's, Joe, for what I remember.
Yeah, I
anyway,
think it's
probably Rowntree's. Yeah,
It's probably owned by Nestle's or something.
yeah,
now.
it will be now.
But,
yeah.
So this is a beautifully illustrated copy of this play by Barrie. It's a comedy of manners. The story of a young girl and who falls in love and then falls out of love due to a misunderstanding. But it's got a happy ending.
He likes happy endings.
He liked happy endings, did Barrie. It's got lovely little black and white pictures and then these lovely coloured ones too.
That fantastic for the art alone. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Pretty much all the action takes place in the house and on the street in Quality Street.
And as mentioned, it's about Ann Street in the new town of Edinburgh, which was full of the poshest of societies. So he'd be looking at them, Jane Barrie would be looking at them with a leveller's kind of head on them, trying to be something that they're not, looking at these ladies, dainty ladies, much in the same way that Robert Burns did it when he was looking at the high society and he would write about them. So there's this element of, well, we can look at you, but you're not better than us. Yeah.
Very much.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is another Barrie one, another well-known, though not his most famous book, The Admirable Crichton. And this is, again, about the social reversal of roles. A family are shipwrecked on a desert island, and, of course, they can't do anything for themselves, and it ends up being the servants that save them with their skills. And, again, this has got very lovely illustrations.
Wonderful. Yeah, fantastic.
You've got John Buck in there, famous for his 39 Steps.
Another incredibly prolific author. I don't know how on earth he had time to be a solicitor, and he goes on to be Governor General of Canada as well. He wrote a 26-volume history of the First World War, and as well as these novels and some historical biographies. He wrote a biography of Scott, for example, and Oliver Cromwell.
And we've got Arthur Conan Doyle.
It's the only one of Conan Doyle's books that Janet had in her collection. She has some authors who we've almost forgotten today, and she always says, don't forget about people like George MacDonald. George MacDonald was one of the first people to write fantasy literature and was a huge influence on C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. We've got all of his books there, which are actually intriguing. Dealings with the Fairies is one of the titles.
Yeah. The fairies are always big issues up here in Scotland, aren't they?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Always talking about the fairies.
Yeah. Even I think that's where the expression "away with the fairies" comes. The Scottish expression, away with the fairies. Now I notice up here also you've got a little poster up here for your oldest book in the library as well. So it's interesting to see that, and it's about Christian philosophy of John Duns Scotus, 1476.
Right.
Yes. Today, this is the oldest book we have at Innerpeffray, so Janet's given us our oldest book as well. It's written by the philosopher John Duns Scotus, known as the Subtle Doctor to some people. Still read today. People may have heard of Scotus colleges. He was born in Berwick, or just outside Berwick, in a place called Duns. Really all we know about him is his name is John, because he's Scotus, a Scotsman from Duns. He wrote this book in Oxford and he taught on the continent, so he wasn't in Scotland for a long time, but it's sometimes known as the first Scottish book because it's the first printed book that has a connection to Scotland.
And he's got a college in the Vatican, the Scottish College, where the young priests, Scottish priests go. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. He was incredibly controversial in his time. And this book, which is the 4th volume of his Questions in 4 Books of Statements, which is one of those titles that you think, I still don't know what that's about.
Say that again. Questions
in 4 books of statements.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a philosopher's title.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just to understand the title of it.
So it was printed in Venice, But it was sold to a community of monks in southern Bavaria. And we have two pieces of evidence for that. The first is the cover, which it's made of wood, it's made of oak, and then it's been wrapped in a pigskin that's bleached to look like vellum, which is a little bit cheaper. Pigskin is your first clue as to where this book was bound. And this little icon here on the binding, I don't know if you'll be able to pick it up, but it looks a bit like a man in the moon face.
Yeah, it was like a crescent moon.
This is a unique stamp for a bookbinder in Bavaria, thanks to University of St Andrews, who looked up the database for me.
Book.
So the oldest book at Innerpeffray is printed in 1476. It was printed in Venice. They'd only had a printing press in Venice for about 8 years when this was produced. So it's brand new technology. And it's got this huge, thick, protective wooden cover.
Amazing.
It doesn't have the kind of title page we would expect in a book today. It just goes straight in. And these two columns here are print made up of individual pieces of type. I turn it round for you here, Mike, you maybe see it better.
Yeah. Okay.
Written in
So-
Latin.
It's written in Latin, and it's got notes all over it in Latin as well. And it's an abbreviated kind of Latin that was used in manuscripts to save space. So even for Latin scholars, it's quite tricky to read today. The red is also put on by hand, and this is a job called rubrication, which just means red, that was done to help you read it. I've already said that they used an abbreviated language. They also tried to cram in as much as possible, and that means that they didn't put paragraph marks or spaces. So the red breaks it up for you, it makes it easier to read.
That makes sense. Yeah.
The red stops about a third of the way through, but the commentary goes all the way through.
So do we know who's putting the commentary in it? Who's writing the notes?
Well, this line here basically says this book belongs to.
Oh, okay.
And this is why we know that it was owned by a monastery. It was owned by a Franciscan community in southern Germany. It's quite likely that the comments are from that institution, although we know that they're not modern, we don't know at what point they would have put them in, because chances are it stayed there for quite a long time. Yes. And it's certainly been read all the way through. We're making a joke about it upstairs, but we can prove this was read because somebody's written notes about it, and they're referring directly to the text. We particularly like the little pointing fingers, which of course I won't be able to find one now because there's one here. It's a nice
right there.
illustrated pointing hand. It's known as a manicule, which just means hand, and it's I suppose 15th century highlighter pen. It means that bit's important.
Yeah.
You get lots of these all the way through the text.
I can almost imagine this being used as almost like a university text, because so many books that I had at university, I was also writing in the and then underlining things, as you say, like a highlighter pen. I never thought of putting little fingers on it to point.
I'm mounting a campaign to get everybody now to draw little manicules instead of using a highlighter. It's much more fun.
Yes. Excellent. This is a treasure in itself. 1476.
1476, yeah. It's certainly, I think, the oldest thing I've ever handled. And yeah, it's very beautiful as well, the embossing on the cover there to decorate it. A lot of care was taken about the making of early books, as it still is sometimes today, but we tend to forget that when we buy a paperback from a bookstore, don't we?
And how long this industry has been, since the press was invented, I mean, the whole industry that's still going on now. And I just think of this little Scotsman coming from, say, Duns and the Borders, very highly educated, obviously from a religious background himself, goes over to Europe, writes his, say it again, the title?
Questions in 4 books of statements.
Right, so he writes his questions in 4 books of statements. He then has to sell this concept, so he's writing this with in candlelight, and then he's going to have to find a publisher all the way up. Maybe he's in Rome, maybe somewhere else, but he's then found a publisher in Venice who's going to publish it for him.
Well, it's actually even more complex than that, because John Duns Scotus died in 1308. So his work existed only in manuscript. So he would have to pay somebody to copy out his work and then sell that, which was even more radically expensive than this modern technology here. But it tells us how important his work was, that when this new printing press came along, his work was one they chose to print because people wanted to read it. And it was a revolution. So we think, oh, it'll take me forever to copy that out by hand. You can imagine how expensive that was. But with this, I could produce, well, maybe 500 copies in a couple of months. That's so much more. It can go everywhere. It revolutionised learning and understanding, and, of course, it revolutionised revolution.
It did. We've got a great question here. And it says, did you show The Scots Gardener by John Reid, the first published in 1683 by David Lindsay of Edinburgh?
Yes, that is a book we have here. That this is the voice of understanding here. I didn't show that to you. There's so many books I would love to show you, but John Reid's Scots Gardener is one of my favourites. I love the story that he was a young man. He trained with the Duke of Hamilton's estate. He designed lots of gardens, including at Drummond Castle. But as a young man, he was finishing this book, and he wanted to get it finished and printed because he was emigrating. And he went to the New World, and he started in the Queen's Colony of Jersey, as it was known then. We call it New Jersey today. And he was actually using his skills as a surveyor rather than planting, decorative gardens for the great and the good around Edinburgh. And there's a statue to him in Perth Amboy in New Jersey. And so he had kind of two lives. So he became Surveyor General of New Jersey.
I've got another question, and same person. How are books organised on shelves? Categories, accession, numbers. I think we've got a lady that works in a library here, and so on.
Yeah, they are. The books upstairs are organised by subject. So sometimes we have lots of things in one subject, and sometimes we only have a couple. So sometimes a shelf looks a little bit disorganised because there's lots of subjects on it, but it's maybe because we've only got a couple of them. And then it's alphabetically by author across the shelf, which is to help us find things. We've got a great deal of religious material, divinity, books of sermons, books of commentary, and Bibles. But the joy of Innerpeffray's collection is its varieties. We have Scotland's first gardening book. We have travel books. We have medicine. We have the sciences. We have lots of opinions from the Victorian era. What the world is all about, and what we should do about it, and how to behave, and all of these things. So it's the
Victorians are very good at codifying things.
Absolutely.
If I can just interrupt, we're getting quite a few comments, and a lot of people say they've really missed quite a bit because it's been quite spotty off and on. So just to reassure people, we're going to do it.
So we've got your oldest book here. You've got the first editions. Any other books that you've got? Any other titles so that when people are looking for things, any other Scottish authors you'd like to talk about?
Well, why don't I give you something more modern, as we've looked at the oldest one. I know that you've got a connection to Orkney with George Mackay Brown, and it's
one of my favourites.
Yeah, a fabulous writer and poet, and it's actually 100 years since his birth this year. So I've been saying he's contemporary, and then I realised that he's actually 100 years old. That's not quite contemporary for us here at Innerpeffray. And we've got a wonderful, I keep saying that, but it is a wonderful Janet's collection. She collected not only his first editions, but also special editions that were made of his poems. Yeah. So I'll pop this back on the shelf, and then I'll bring out one of those out.
Now, just give my personal connection to George Mackay Brown is when I was in high school, our head of our English department, Mr. Murray, I don't know if any of Mr. Murray's relatives are still around, he was a good friend of George Mackay Brown. And for our hire, for our national exams here in Scotland Hires, we were, I would say, forced to study George Mackay Brown, his poetry. And it was actually the Orkney Tapestry book that we actually studied. And then we had the opportunity to go up to Orkneys, where George Mackay Brown lived. And we stayed near George Mackay, and he would come and talk to us in a barn, more or less. And he would talk to us about the book. And he actually, when you meet an author talking about the book, and as a kid, we were like 16, we had really no interest in it. We just had to do it for our exams. He brought it alive to us, and it's a completely different experience being up there in the Orkney Island with George Mackay Brown. We were supposed to be there for about 4 days. We ended up staying longer because there were big storms. We couldn't get off the islands. But it was great to meet George Mackay Brown live. And we're celebrating 100 years.
100 years, yes. Well, this is an incredible poet. I've just picked one of them, almost at random, but it's called Keepers of the House. Lovely wood-cutting illustrations in it. So here we are. It's got Janet's name in it.
Janet Saint-Germain.
Yep. Now, I'll just draw your attention to something. How can I do this easily? This is not Janet's handwriting. This is George Mackay Brown's handwriting.
Wow.
Yes. So I know that she visited Orkney several times, but this tells me
Well, we have Janet and I have something in common.
that she met him as well, and there he is. He's signed it too.
Oh wow. And George Mackay Brown is he's got a monument in St Magnus Cathedral in Orkneys.
Yeah. So this is a series of, I think, imaginary legends of the Orkneys. This one we've got Firekin, the name of the guardian who lives in the chimney. And we've got Jambone, the name of the guardian who looks after the cupboard.
Mm-hmm.
And, ooh, can I say this? Tully Rossamath. Tully Rossamathus. No, I can't say it. You say it, John.
I can't say that. Tully Ross and Mother.
Tully Rossanthemus. Tully Rossanthemus.
Okay.
Okay, the name of the garden gnome. There we are. All that for a garden gnome. He's the only keeper of the house you can actually see.
Excellent.
In fact, Tully, in future, I'm going to just call him T.
T.
I think we'll just call him T as well, shall we? And just a little example of his storytelling ability. Mackay Brown's poetry is beautifully sparse, isn't it? He uses very few words to say it's so much. And even when he's telling stories as well, you don't feel there's any extra there. It's almost the exact opposite of Walter Scott.
Yeah.
Who puts in, tons and tons and tons of words in order to fill it out. So we're hoping to do a George Mackay Brown special event at Innerpeffray sometime in October or November. So.
Oh. Yeah. We'll sign off here next to this beautiful little rowan tree, mountain ash it's called, but it's a rowan tree. And it's got its berries on it, so it's looking really great. But the rowan tree was planted in memory of Janet Lindsay Burns Saint-Germain on the day of her memorial service in New York, April the 22nd, 2017. And so this is commemorating the gift that Janet Lindsay Burns Saint-Germain gave to Innerpeffray Library. Absolutely fantastic, generous bequest. And it's good to know that people like that are around the world and they want to send this back home to what we can benefit from. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Lara.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
I think the pleasure's all ours. I can honestly say I think the pleasure